think my uncle murdered his daughter. Nobody bats an eye when the old get sick. It's the way of the world after all. You're born, slowly grow old, then you die. Sure, people will mourn, a few people may even weep at your funeral, and if you're lucky someone will lay an occasional flower on your headstone. But when the young die, that's a completely different story. My little cousin Olivia was only 6 years old when she fell down the stairs of her 2-story house. The fall had snapped her neck somewhere along those 15 fateful steps. It was her mother who had found her tiny body. I could only imagine the horror she felt when her eyes met the sight of little Olivia's neck at a 90-degree angle. The thought made my spine shiver. My Aunt Lizzie now sobbed uncontrollably as we sat in the little chapel. Olivia's casket opened for the few people who knew her in life to come to say goodbye. If Olivia had died an old woman, the chapel might be overflowing, but in 6 short years, she had not made many connections in her brief life. While many relatives were present, only a handful would come to know Olivia as well as I had come to know her. I had been her designated babysitter for many years. Her little lungs drew breath, so my heart shattered when I got the news. My Uncle Jesse spoke for his daughter in our hour of suffering. Olivia was a cheerful, energetic, and playful little kid. Her enthusiasm for life brought joy to anyone in her vicinity. Life can be cruel, unjust, and inhumane, but it's not our place to judge the work of the man upstairs. When it's your time, when he calls you up, when God needs you back, we can only heed the call. Olivia was too precious for this world. I believe our Heavenly Father knew that. That is why I can smile knowing that my little girl is in a better place. I don't know how he could be so calm and composed while talking about his recently departed daughter. She wasn't even my daughter, and even my voice cracked whenever I spoke her name. He must have had a heart of stone, I thought to myself. Who am I to judge how someone mourned the passing of their little girl? After all, we are all different. Those who wish to say one last goodbye to Olivia, please do so now. The casket will be closed in a few short minutes, the funeral director informed. The rustling of a few people standing sounded over my Aunt Lizzie's sobbing. I didn't want to go up and see Olivia's body in that state, but my aunt clutched my arm and pulled me with her for more support. How could I refuse? The line leading up to the casket began to thin, and soon we were faced with little Olivia's peaceful sleeping face. She wore a pristine white dress that seemed to blend with the casket's padding. Her satin black hair created a deep contrast with the casket's insides. Her skin looked cold and glazed over. Aunt Lizzie's head dropped onto Olivia as she gave her little girl one last worldly embrace. Why, Lord, why? Tears streamed down onto Olivia's dress, darkening some of the areas where they soaked into the fabric. I comforted my aunt and could not help but shed my tears as well. The memories of little Olivia were playing in my mind. Olivia, oh Olivia, my aunt cried. I looked down at Olivia's sleeping face, never expecting her to react to her mother's calls. Olivia, my Olivia. As the last A of her name left her mother's mouth, her eyes snapped open, thrusting my heart into the pit of my stomach. My eyes instantly dried up in my terror. Then Olivia's pupils trained their gaze on me. I wanted to do nothing more than to scream, but as I opened my mouth, the sound never managed to bypass the lump in my throat. I let my Aunt Lizzie go, taking a step backward in the process. Just then, I knocked into someone. My head shot around to see my Uncle Jesse looking at his daughter's face, unfazed by her soulless stare. He then looked at me with an expressionless face and gave me a smile of pity, before returning to his daughter's facade. I shot back around to look at Olivia, but once again was met with her peacefully sleeping expression. What the fuck? I thought to myself. Olivia was I must have imagined it. It must have been my imagination. What other explanation could there be? My uncle's cold hand snaked across my shoulders in an attempt to comfort me, and it did, before he whispered in my ear, "It will be our little secret. You will tell no one of this." For the rest of the funeral, I was in a state of constant shock, trying to make sense of the situation but never could. It had been a week since Olivia had died. They had pumped her body full of embalming fluid, and I'd even ran over the coroner's report. a complete evisceration of the C1 and C2 vertebrae, resulting in a complete severance of the spinal cord, pronounced dead at the scene. There was no way Olivia could still be alive. Absolutely no way. Those words played in my head as the first few pails of earth began to blanket her coffin. But my resolve was constantly questioned by Uncle Jesse's 1,000-mile stare from across the freshly dug hole. There is no way Olivia is still alive. My Aunt Lizzie continued in her emotional state long after Olivia had died. It's not hard to imagine given that Olivia was only a child. Aunt Lizzie and Uncle Jesse's lives revolved around my little cousin. I tried my best to stay away. It was hard for me to hear her shrieking cries. As much as I loved Aunt Lizzie, there's only so much sadness a person can take. I preferred to push little Olivia as far out of my mind as I could. Well, there was that, but also Uncle Jesse's comment on the day of the funeral. I tried to dismiss it as being part of my imagination, but no matter how hard I tried, his words were as clear as that day they tickled my ear. It will be our little secret. That fear, however, would have to be put on the back burner, because Aunt Lizzie had called me over to help get rid of some of Olivia's things. Looking at them had brought too much grief to her heart, and she was having a hard time boxing them up, so it was up to me to lend a helping hand. I walked into their house, the same house where I'd babysat Olivia so many times. Everywhere I looked, memories of that little girl flooded back into my mind. Then my eyes met the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't help but imagine her little body sprawled out on the hardwood floor. A door creaked open, and I jolted in my uneasiness. It was Aunt Lizzie stepping out of the master bedroom, situated on the first floor. Her eyes were puffy, she'd been crying, and she attempted to compose herself before greeting me with a warm smile. Our conversation was brief. She'd only given me instructions on what to box up. To my surprise, her instructions were to get rid of everything but Olivia's twin bed. She disappeared into her bedroom, and I thought I heard her faintly sobbing through the door. I trained my eyes on the top of the stairs, precariously stepping around where I'd imagine Olivia drew her last breath. There was a sense of apprehension as I reached the second floor, and I swore the air was colder as my foot graced the last step. But I pushed it out of my mind as I plunged myself into the task at hand. There was a lot to box up. I saw my breath condense in front of my face. The air temperature had plunged drastically. I felt my skin pimple and goosebumps, not because of the cold, but because a familiar figure graced the edge of my eye. Standing in the corner was a little girl wearing a white dress. Olivia? Her skin was no longer the same color as the day the casket's lid fell on her restful face. It was pale, icy, and cold. The mortician had done a fantastic job of styling her hair, but it now draped over much of her face in an unkempt way. She lifted her head, but before it could reach its full extension, it slumped over with a loud crack. Likewise, her cervical spine now pointed to the ceiling as it poked through the skin on her neck. Her head may have been resting on her shoulder, but her eyes looked at me with the same intensity as the day I swore I saw her open them while she lay in that tiny little box. I fell onto her bed, cowering backward until the drywall caressed my rear. Our eyes stayed there for what felt like hours. In reality, it was only seconds. Little Olivia raised a jagged finger, pointing to her nightstand beside her bed. I was too fearful to let go of my knees that were pressed up against my chest, but Olivia did not waver. She stood there steadfast, her eyes planted on me, her finger gesturing at the nightstand. I wasn't going to be let go until I investigated whatever she needed me to see. I cautiously unfurled myself out of my beetle position and crawled my way over to the first drawer, pulling it out while making sure Olivia wasn't going to jump on me. Inside were many of Olivia's crayon drawings. Many were family portraits, and some I'd even helped draw myself on the many nights I babysat. But as I flipped through the pieces, they became less wholesome and more strange. There was a stick figure of a little girl crying, a pair of eyes peering at the girl through the door, a drawing of a man, evident in the stick figure touting a beard, covered in blood. I'm pretty sure it was my Uncle Jesse, and a picture that made my heart sink. The little stick figure drawn girl crying in a corner as Mommy and Daddy fought. I looked over at Olivia, but her finger had not been lowered. I flipped the page one more time and was met by a drawing of Uncle Jesse caressing a little girl with her head flopped over to the side, the mummy stick figure off to the side weeping. I looked back over at my little cousin as her finger finally lowered. "Did Uncle Jesse do this to you?" I questioned, but she made no gestures. I returned my eyes to the drawing. It must have been, I thought to myself. That would explain why Uncle Jesse was acting so unfazed at the funeral, and why he didn't want Olivia coming back from the grave. So she came to you too, huh? My head swiveled to the bedroom door. It was Uncle Jesse, standing there as I held Olivia's testimonial in my hand. I looked over the corner where Olivia once stood, but she was gone. You killed Olivia?" I quivered. "No, McKenna, it's not like that. Let me explain." I inched back to the far edge of the twin bed, ready to run at a moment's notice. "What do you mean she came to me too?" I questioned. "McKenna, calm down. Let me explain. I need to tell someone about this. I don't know what to make of it." He stepped to me, outstretching his hands. "I have to get out of here. I know what he's done. I'm next," I thought to myself. As soon as a large enough opening presented itself, I darted behind Uncle Jesse, out of the door, down the stairs, and out of the house, all while looking over my shoulder, but Uncle Jesse never gave chase. I was numb the whole ride home, reliving all the encounters I had with Uncle Jesse throughout the years. He loved Olivia so much. How could he do such a thing? I don't even know how I made it home in that condition. It's as if I made it home on instinct. But as my tires came to a halt in my driveway, I remembered. Aunt Lizzie was still in that house with that monster. I had to warn her. Before I could get to the phone, it rang. The caller ID said, "Aunt Lizzie." Had he gotten to her already and was calling to taunt me from her phone? How could I be so stupid? I left her behind to die. I carefully lifted the phone to my ear and answered the call. "He's dead. Your Uncle Jesse is dead," Aunt Lizzie cried through a mountain of gut-wrenching tears. A few weeks had passed and I'd decided to move in with my Aunt Lizzie. She was all alone in the world now. I was the only family she had left. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't speak, she just sat there looking at some random wall. It didn't help that the world had this strange sense of irony. You see, my Uncle Jesse had fallen down those same steps as Olivia, and in the same gory fashion, his neck snapped like a twig. I felt like there was some poetic justice in how it all happened, but I wish it didn't affect Aunt Lizzie so much. She started to make some progress in her mourning process. I no longer had to hand feed her for every meal. She made sure to down a few sips of soup every once in a while. She no longer laid in bed until dinner. Noon was often the latest, and her gaze began to unglue itself from the plain white walls. Everything was progressing splendidly. That is, until the night they showed up. Aunt Lizzie sat on the couch watching Saturday Night Live, the only thing that seemed to tug at the edges of her mouth. As I cleaned up after our broccoli cheddar chicken supper, it was my favorite dish to cook, and one of the few solids my Aunt Lizzie could stomach. But it sure was a hassle to clean up. I scrubbed and scrubbed the pan, but the breadcrumbs were baked on like old gum on concrete. I plowed my soapy sponge into the sink as I gave a frustrated grunt. I needed something more drastic to clean the pan. I needed my wire brush. I kept it in the cabinet above the fridge, but as I turned around to get it, I gave an ear-piercing shriek. On the other side of the kitchen stood Olivia and Uncle Jesse. Their heads flopped over to the side in almost identical fashion. The decay on Olivia's face was now more prominent, but Jesse's was fresher and less weathered. Though still pale, cold, and grotesque like Olivia's on the day I saw her in the bedroom. Little Olivia held her father's hand by the finger. Uncle Jesse stood paralyzed. That is, until we moved towards the notepad magnetically stuck to the fridge. He scribbled a few words on the paper and stepped back to let me read what he'd written. "You didn't let me explain." I looked back over to him in confusion. Little Olivia tugged on his pant leg, gesturing to let her write on the notepad next. The father passed the notepad down to her. As she pulled her personal crayon from the dress's little pocket, I saw her face concentrate as she wrote some of the words she knew how to write. When she finished, she flipped the pad over to me. It was hard for me to read it with it being a mix of lowercase and capital letters, not to mention the grammatical mistakes. It read, "Mummy did it." I read over her writing again and again until it finally clicked. Mummy did it. It was all clear to me now. Little Olivia was not trying to warn me about her father, but about her mother. Uncle Jesse wasn't trying to kill me on the day he died. He was trying to explain that he had suspicions about what had actually happened to his daughter. Olivia had given her father the same warning, but it had been too late. Just then, the father and daughter duo raised their fingers simultaneously, pointing behind me. The sound of a drawer opening, along with rattling of utensils, met my ear. I pivoted slowly. Her eyes were no longer void, no longer sad. Now they were trained on me. My Aunt Lizzie had found a very large kitchen knife and started to approach me.